War is built on destruction, but victory sometimes is built on illusion. In the dark final years of World War II, when the fate of Europe hung by a thread, a group of artists, sound engineers, designers, and dreamers were gathered by the United States Army for a mission so secret, it wouldn't be spoken of for nearly 50 years. Their task was not to fight, but to fool Hitler's army. They called themselves the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but history would remember them as the Ghost Army. It began in 1944, when the Allies prepared for the liberation of Europe. Hitler's forces were still powerful, and any misstep could cost tens of thousands of lives. The U.S. military realized that brute force wasn't enough. They needed deception. They needed artists who could make an army appear where none existed. So, in a quiet building in Washington, D.C., a secret unit was formed. They recruited 1,100 men, not from battlefields, but from art schools, advertising agencies, and Hollywood sound studios. Many were painters, sculptors, photographers, or set designers. These weren't traditional soldiers, they were illusionists in uniform. Their commander, Colonel Harry Reeder, gave them a mission. Your job is to deceive, distract, and confuse the enemy. You will fight with your imagination. One of the recruits, Bill Blass, a 21-year-old fashion illustrator from Indiana, who would later become a famous designer, wrote in his journal, "It felt like we were joining a circus, not a war. But their weapons were ingenious. The Ghost Army used inflatable rubber tanks, fake airplanes, and dummy artillery that could be carried by a few men and inflated in minutes. They used giant speakers mounted on trucks to blast recorded sounds of armored divisions. Tanks rolling, men shouting, chains clanking, echoing across miles. They painted fake uniforms, created counterfeit unit patches, and even forged radio transmissions that mimicked the communication patterns of real divisions. Every detail mattered, down to the placement of coffee cups in fake encampments. Their first test came in Normandy shortly after D-Day. The real Allied forces were pushing inland, and the Germans were desperate to locate their next move. The Ghost Army's mission was to distract the Nazi intelligence units, convincing them that thousands of troops were gathering miles away from where the real attack would strike. On a foggy morning, the unit deployed their illusions. Within hours, a field that had been empty now looked and sounded like a full armored division preparing for combat. German reconnaissance planes flew overhead and photographed the tanks. They reported hundreds of vehicles. The deception worked perfectly, but the risk was unimaginable. These men carried no heavy weapons. If the Germans discovered their trick, they'd be wiped out in minutes. Every time they set up, they knew a single shell could expose their lie. Private Arthur Shilstone, one of the Ghost Army sketch artists, later recalled, "We were bluffing with our lives. It was a poker game where losing meant death." In August 1944, the unit performed one of their boldest operations near Seine River, France. The Germans believed a U.S. division was preparing to cross the river at a specific point, because the Ghost Army made it look that way. They deployed hundreds of fake vehicles, created pontoon bridges, and broadcasted the sounds of troop movement through hidden speakers. The real crossing happened miles away. Hitler's generals moved reinforcements to the wrong location, saving thousands of Allied lives, all because of an illusion. These soldiers of deception often operated within miles of enemy lines. They'd paint insignias of real U.S. divisions on their jeeps, drive through villages pretending to be officers, and spread false rumors in local cafes, all to feed misinformation back to the Nazis. One Ghost Army member, Fred Fox, once remarked, "We were actors, not on a stage, but on a battlefield." They used creativity as a weapon, art as armor, and imagination as ammunition. But success came with a cost. Every time the Ghost Army faked a movement, they had to stay behind to keep the illusion alive while real troops advanced. They were often the last to leave, knowing the Germans might attack their phantom army at any moment. In one mission near Metz, France, they were nearly discovered. A German patrol stumbled close to their camp and spotted an inflated Sherman tank that had partially deflated in the cold night air. It looked unnatural. The men froze as the Germans stared. Then, one of the Ghost Army soldiers, thinking fast, walked up, pretended to inspect the tank, and shouted in English, Someone get the air pump? This one's losing pressure." The Germans laughed and drove off, thinking it was a joke. It was a near miracle. A single laugh had saved their lives. By the end of 1944, the Ghost Army had conducted more than 20 deception missions across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Every time they operated, they made Hitler's army chase shadows, and every time they bought real soldiers precious time to advance. But the biggest illusion was yet to come, a deception so grand that even Allied generals doubted it could work. It would unfold in 1945, as Hitler's forces launched their last desperate attack, the Battle of the Bulge. The winter of 1944 was brutal. Europe was frozen under snow and fear. Hitler, cornered and desperate, launched one final assault through the Ardennes forest, an operation history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. For the Allies, it was chaos. Units were scattered, communication lines were broken, and confusion reigned across the Western Front. The Ghost Army, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, was ordered to perform their boldest mission yet, to convince Hitler's generals that a massive American division was preparing for a counterattack. The truth? There was no division, only 1,100 artists, sound engineers, and set designers armed with rubber tanks, fake artillery, and a handful of sound trucks. The operation began near the Rhine River, early 1945. The real American forces were repositioning secretly for an offensive elsewhere, leaving a dangerous gap in the line. If the Germans realized that area was empty, they could break through and devastate the Allied advance. So, the Ghost Army was sent in to fill the void, not with bullets but with illusions. For 3 freezing nights, the men inflated hundreds of rubber tanks under the dim glow of blackout lamps. The cold air made the rubber stiff, and frost bit through their gloves. But they worked in silence, knowing discovery meant death. By dawn, the empty field was transformed. Rows of Sherman tanks gleamed under the pale winter sun, though not one of them was real. Fake half-tracks lined the roads. Canvas tents dotted the hills. To the eyes of German scouts, it looked like a massive American army had arrived overnight. Then came the sound trucks. Each carried enormous speakers capable of blasting recorded audio of armored columns. Technicians mixed engine roars, shouted commands, metallic clanking, and even idle chatter of soldiers by campfires. The sounds echoed for miles through the valley, bouncing off the snow, perfectly timed with the movement of the fake tanks. The Germans listened and believed. They began shifting their troops to intercept the attack, pulling critical forces away from where the real U.S. divisions were preparing to strike. It was psychological warfare at its finest, a battle fought not with bullets, but with imagination and deception. But every illusion came with danger. The men were unarmed except for sidearms. If the Germans attacked, they'd be helpless. On the second night, enemy artillery began shelling their position, random fire probing the line. The rubber tanks exploded spectacularly when hit, bursting into torn black sheets. One soldier, Private George Reb, later recalled the terrifying moment. "A tank went up like a balloon at a kid's birthday party. And that's when we realized how close we were to being found out." The men scrambled to repair the illusion, inflating replacements before daylight. They painted over scorch marks, moved fake tracks, and kept up the charade. Even under shellfire, the show had to go on. Meanwhile, the radio deception team, experts trained to mimic authentic military transmissions, worked tirelessly inside jeeps fitted with transmitters. They impersonated real officers, communicating fake orders across encrypted channels the Germans were known to intercept. Every phrase, every pause, every burst of static was rehearsed to sound real. They weren't just sending messages, they were performing. One operator, Jack Macy, later explained, "We didn't fire guns. We fired words. And our words moved entire divisions." The Ghost Army also used a visual deception unit, known as the Special Effects Section. They painted insignias of famous U.S. divisions on their vehicles, like the 6th Armored or 9th Infantry Division, and drove through liberated towns posing as real troops. They would chat with locals, leave fake messages, and even let German spies overhear plans in cafes or train stations. Every small detail was a piece of the grand illusion.